Commander Zeth Valor stood in the command center of the research station, his three eyes focused on the holographic display floating before him. The red zone glowed like a warning beacon against the green landscape of planet Zarian 7 for 3 weeks now. That circular area had remained completely empty of all animal life, and nobody could explain why Dr. Luna Corin adjusted her scanner for the 100th time that day. The tall, blue-skinned scientist had been studying wildlife behavior for over 20 years across dozens of planets, but nothing had prepared her for what she was seeing on Zarian 7. She looked up from her instruments and shook her head at the commander. "The readings are still the same," she said, her voice carrying frustration. "There is nothing dangerous about that zone. No radiation, no toxic gases, no harmful energy signatures. According to every instrument we have, that area should be perfectly safe for any living creature." Captain Rex Morrison entered the command center, his heavy boots echoing on the metal floor. The human military officer had been leading rescue attempts for the past week, and his face showed the strain of repeated failures. Behind him walked 3 members of his team, all looking equally defeated. "Another drone lost?" Rex reported, pulling off his helmet. "Same as the others. The moment it crosses that invisible line, all systems shut down. We tried remote control, we tried autonomous operation, we even tried simple mechanical devices. Nothing works once it enters that zone." Commander Valor's antennae twitched with anxiety. Inside that forbidden circle were 5 small creatures that represented hope for an entire species. The thermal scanners could detect their heat signatures, but they were growing weaker each day. The Shadow Panther cubs had been trapped there since the seismic event 3 weeks ago, and time was running out. Dr. Corin pulled up another display showing the amazing sight that surrounded the danger zone. Hundreds of animals had gathered at the boundary, creating the strangest gathering anyone had ever witnessed on any planet. Predators and prey stood side by side, all facing the empty zone but none daring to enter. "Look at this behavior pattern," she said, pointing to the screen. "These creatures have abandoned every natural instinct they possess. The Razorhawks are perched next to ground runners. The Night Stalkers are lying down beside grass eaters. Species that have been hunting each other for millions of years are now acting like they share a common enemy. The Shadow Panthers themselves were the most disturbing sight of all. The adult cats paced endlessly along the barrier, their phase-shifting fur rippling with anxiety. Their calls could be heard day and night as they cried for their trapped young. The magnificent predators, each weighing over 300 pounds and capable of tearing through solid metal, refused to take a single step into the zone. "What makes it worse," Captain Morrison continued, "is that our artificial intelligence systems are also refusing to help. Every time we try to program a rescue mission into the computer, it claims the task parameters are impossible to process. The AI simply will not acknowledge that the zone exists." Commander Valor walked to the large window overlooking the valley. In the distance, he could see the gathered animals creating a living wall around the mysterious area. The sight should have been beautiful, but instead it filled him with dread. Every instinct that evolution had given these creatures was screaming the same message: stay away. "The cubs are Shadow Panthers," Dr. Corin said quietly. "There are only 47 of these animals left in the entire galaxy. 5 cubs represent more than 10% of the species. If we lose them, the Shadow Panthers might never recover." The commander knew the numbers well. The Galactic Wildlife Conservation Corps have been fighting to save endangered species across hundreds of worlds for over 50 years. Some battles they won, some they lost, but they had never faced a situation where the rescue itself seemed impossible. "Sir," said Lieutenant Amy Chun, one of Captain Morrison's team members, "we have tried everything our technology can offer. Advanced robotics, quantum drones, even biological constructs designed to mimic local wildlife. Nothing can cross that boundary and continue functioning." Commander Valor turned back to the group. His decision-making process was usually quick and efficient, but this situation challenged every protocol in their handbook. The cubs had been without food for 4 days now. The thermal readings showed they were still alive, but they were weakening rapidly. What about the local wildlife? He asked, "Have any of them attempted to enter the zone?" Dr. Corin shook her head. "Not a single creature has crossed that line. Even insects avoid the area. We have observed behavior that suggests they would rather die than enter that space. Yesterday, a small herd of grass eaters was being chased by pack hunters. Instead of fleeing into the zone for safety, they turned and fought. Most of them died rather than cross the boundary." The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. If creatures that had never encountered advanced technology could sense danger that their instruments could not detect, what did that say about the nature of the threat? Captain Morrison spoke up again. "Commander, there is one option we have not considered. Earth's Department of Impossible Situations has been handling cases like this for the past few years. They have specialists who work in areas where conventional technology fails." "You mean humans?" Commander Valor said. "Yes, sir. There is a particular individual who has successfully completed missions that our best scientists declared impossible. His methods are primitive by our standards, but his success rate is remarkable." Dr. Corin looked skeptical. "You want to send a human into a zone that terrifies every evolved creature on this planet, a zone that shuts down our most advanced technology?" "The Cubs are dying," Captain Morrison replied simply. "We have exhausted every other option." Commander Valor studied the display once more. The 5 small heat signatures were noticeably dimmer than they had been that morning. He thought about the shadow panther species, about the desperate calls of the parent cats, about the impossible nature of the situation they faced. "Contact Earth," he said finally. "Request immediate assistance from their specialist division. Tell them we need someone who can work in conditions that make no scientific sense." As the communication officer began preparing the message, Dr. Corin continued watching the animal behavior patterns on her screens. Something was building out there among the gathered creatures. Their agitation was increasing, and she could not shake the feeling that they were running out of time for reasons beyond just the cub's survival. The message went out across space, carrying with it the hope that somewhere among the humans there was someone crazy enough to walk into a place that evolution itself had marked as forbidden. Jake Mitchell was chopping wood behind his cabin when the communication device started beeping. He set down his axe and wiped the sweat from his forehead before walking over to the small device mounted on his porch. The message indicator was flashing red, which meant someone had an emergency that required his particular set of skills. The cabin sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by Alaska wilderness that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Jake had built it himself 5 years ago when he decided that civilization had become too complicated for his taste. He lived simply, using basic tools and relying on skills his grandfather had taught him decades ago. At 42 years old, Jake had spent 20 years in various military units before discovering that the galaxy had problems that required something other than advanced weapons and sophisticated tactics. The Department of Impossible Situations had found him 3 years ago, and since then he had been called to handle cases that made no sense to anyone else. He activated the message display and read the request from Zarian 7. The situation was familiar in its impossibility. Advanced aliens with technology far beyond Earth's capabilities had encountered something that their instruments could not explain and their artificial intelligence could not process. They needed a human who was willing to walk into danger that made no logical sense. Jake packed his gear with the same methodical approach he used for everything. His equipment bag contained items that most galactic travelers would consider primitive: rope made from natural fibers, a compass that his grandfather had carried in 3 wars, basic medical supplies, a knife that had been forged rather than manufactured, and various tools that relied on simple mechanical principles rather than electronic systems. The journey to Zarian 7 took 6 days aboard the research vessel Endeavor. During the trip, Jake studied everything the crew could tell him about shadow panthers. These creatures were remarkable predators with the ability to shift their appearance to blend with their surroundings. They possessed pack intelligence that rivaled some spacefaring species and had survival instincts honed by millions of years of evolution. Dr. Luna Corin spent hours explaining the scientific data, they had collected about the mysterious zone. She showed him energy readings, electromagnetic field measurements, atmospheric analysis results, and detailed behavioral studies of the local wildlife. Jake listened politely but seemed more interested in simple questions that the data could not answer. How do the animals act when they get close to the edge? He asked. They stop moving forward and retreat immediately, she replied. Do they look scared or sick? Neither really. They just turn around and leave, as if they suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. Jake nodded and continued studying the visual recordings of the trapped cubs. The 5 young shadow panthers were clearly suffering from lack of food and water, but they appeared alert and responsive. They had not tried to leave the zone, which suggested they were either unable to do so or unwilling to make the attempt. Captain Rex Morrison was skeptical about bringing a human to solve a problem that had defeated their best technology. He questioned Jake about his methods and experience, trying to understand how primitive equipment could succeed where advanced systems had failed. What makes you think you can enter a zone that shuts down our most sophisticated robots? Morrison asked. Maybe because I am not sophisticated, Jake replied with a slight smile. The captain was not amused by the response, but Dr. Corrin found herself increasingly interested in Jake's approach to the problem. Instead of focusing on the scientific measurements, he spent most of his time watching recordings of animal behavior. He seemed particularly fascinated by the way different species had gathered at the boundary. This is unusual, Jake observed, pointing to a section of video. These animals hate each other, but they are standing together. They are not fighting, not competing for territory, not doing anything except staying away from that zone. Yes, we have noted the unprecedented cooperation between natural enemies, Dr. Corrin agreed. But look at their body language, Jake continued. They are not afraid? Afraid animals run away or hide or get aggressive. These animals are just staying put like they are following orders. The observation made Dr. Corrin reconsider her own analysis. She had been so focused on measuring fear responses that she had missed the possibility that the animals were responding to something else entirely. Their behavior was more like obedience than terror. When the Endeavour arrived at Zarian 7, Jake's first request surprised everyone. He wanted to spend time observing the gathered animals in person, without any scanning equipment or protective gear. He simply walked to the edge of the restricted area and sat down on a rock, watching the wildlife with his naked eyes. Commander Zeth Valor joined him after an hour of silent observation. The alien commander was curious about Jake's methods and concerned about the deteriorating condition of the trapped cubs. What do you see that our instruments cannot detect? Valor asked. Your instruments are looking for danger, Jake replied. But maybe the problem is not about danger. Maybe it is about something else. Jake pointed to a group of large predators that were resting near the boundary. The creatures were completely relaxed, grooming themselves and interacting normally. With each other, they showed no signs of stress or anxiety. Those animals are not afraid, Jake continued. They are just following a rule that they understand, but we do not. Something is telling them to stay away, and they are listening. Doctor. Corrin arrived with her portable scanners, eager to gather more data while Jake conducted his observation. She was frustrated when he asked her to turn off all her electronic equipment. I need to listen, he explained. Your machines make noise that covers up other sounds. For the first time in weeks, the scientists experienced the area around the zone without the constant humming of their instruments. The silence was profound and somehow uncomfortable. Even the animals seemed unusually quiet, as if they were all holding their breath. Jake pulled out his grandfather's compass and watched the needle swing wildly before settling in a direction that made no sense according to the planet's magnetic field. He made notes in a small paper notebook using a pencil, ignoring the advanced recording devices that Dr. Corrin offered. The cubs have been in there for almost 4 weeks, Commander Valor said. They cannot survive much longer without food and proper care. Jake stood up and shouldered his simple pack. He checked his rope, tested his knife, and verified that his compass was working properly. The rescue team watched in amazement as he prepared to attempt what their most advanced technology could not accomplish. "You are really going to walk in there with just basic equipment?" Captain Morrison asked. "Sometimes the old ways work when the new ways do not," Jake replied. He approached the invisible boundary that had stopped every previous rescue attempt. The gathered animals turned to watch him. Hundreds of eyes focused on the human who was about to do something that their instincts told them was impossible. Jake's first step across the invisible line sent a wave of movement through the assembled animals. Every creature simultaneously took 3 steps backward, their eyes never leaving the human who had just done something they considered impossible. The Shadow Panthers stopped their pacing and stood perfectly still, watching with an intensity that made Dr. Corrin hold her breath inside the zone. Jake immediately understood why every living thing on the planet refused to enter this space. The silence was not just an absence of sound, but something that pressed against his mind like a heavy blanket. It felt wrong in ways that his body could sense, even though his instruments showed nothing dangerous. His grandfather's compass spun in circles for several seconds before pointing in a direction that defied everything Jake knew about magnetic fields. The needle was steady and confident, indicating a path that led deeper into the restricted area. Jake had learned to trust the old compass during his military years when electronic navigation failed, and he was not about to doubt it now. The landscape inside the zone looked normal to his eyes, but walking through it felt like moving through thick water. Each step required more effort than it should have, not because of any physical resistance, but because every instinct in his body was screaming at him to turn around and leave immediately. Jake forced himself to continue forward, relying on the breathing techniques he had learned during his military training. The silence was the worst part, pressing against his eardrums and making him feel like he was buried alive. He understood now why the artificial intelligence systems refused to process data from this area. The wrongness of the place attacked the very concept of logical thinking. After walking for 20 minutes, Jake began to notice something strange about the terrain itself. When he looked directly at rocks or trees, they appeared solid and normal. But when he glimpsed them from the corner of his eye, they seemed to shift position slightly. The landscape was playing tricks with his perception in ways that would have driven a computer system insane. His radio crackled with static as Dr. Corrin tried to maintain contact. Her voice came through in broken fragments, asking about his condition and requesting status updates. Jake responded when he could, but the communication system was clearly struggling with some form of interference that their instruments had not detected. "Still moving forward," he reported during a moment of clear reception. "The compass is working. Everything else feels wrong, but I am not in any danger." The path indicated by his grandfather's compass led him through a series of rocky outcroppings that formed natural corridors. Jake realized he was being guided along a specific route rather than taking the most direct path toward the Cubs. Something wanted him to approach from a particular direction, and he decided to trust the guidance. As he walked deeper into the zone, Jake began to understand why the Shadow Panther Cubs could not leave on their own. The wrongness of the place was not just uncomfortable for adult minds, but would be completely overwhelming for young animals. Their developing nervous systems would be unable to process the conflicting signals, leaving them trapped by their own confusion. The thermal readings had shown the Cubs in a cave formation near the center of the restricted area. Jake's compass led him toward that location, but the journey took much longer than expected because the landscape seemed to fold in on itself. Distances that looked short from outside the zone stretched into long walks once he was actually moving through them. After 2 hours of careful progress, Jake heard the first sound since entering the zone. A weak mewing call echoed from somewhere ahead, the unmistakable cry of a young shadow panther in distress. The sound gave him renewed energy and helped him focus on his mission rather than the oppressive atmosphere. Following the sound, Jake climbed over a series of boulders and found himself looking down into a natural depression in the ground. 5 small forms huddled together in what appeared to be the entrance to a cave system. The Shadow Panther cubs were magnificent even in their weakened state. each about the size of a large dog with fur that shimmered between different colors as it tried to camouflage them against their surroundings. Jake approached slowly, speaking in the calm, steady voice he had used with frightened animals throughout his career. The cubs watched him with intelligent eyes that showed curiosity rather than fear. They had been trapped in this impossible place for weeks, and the arrival of any living creature was probably a relief. The largest cub, clearly the leader of the small group, stood up on unsteady legs and took a few steps toward Jake, the young. Shadow Panther was thin from lack of food but alert and responsive. Jake knelt down and extended his hand, allowing the cub to investigate his scent and decide whether he represented safety or danger. When the cub pressed its head against Jake's palm, he knew he had been accepted. The other 4 cubs began moving closer, their natural caution overcome by weeks of isolation and the desperate need for contact with another living being. Jake examined each of them quickly, checking for injuries or signs of serious illness. The cubs were hungry and dehydrated, but otherwise healthy. Their biggest problem was not physical damage, but psychological trauma from being trapped in a place that violated every natural law they had been born to understand. Jake realized that simply carrying them out of the zone would probably kill them from shock. He established radio contact with Dr. Corrin and explained the situation. The cubs needed gradual reacclimatization to normal space, a process that would take several days of careful work. Jake would need to remain in the zone with them, slowly moving them toward the boundary while their nervous systems adapted to the change. "That means you will be trapped in there for days," Dr. Corrin responded, her concern clear even through the static. "These cubs cannot survive a sudden transition back to normal space," Jake replied. "Their minds have adapted to this place. Moving them too quickly will cause permanent damage or death." Commander Valor's voice came through the radio asking for more details about Jake's plan. The human explained that he would need to become a temporary pack member, using patience and gentle pressure to guide the cubs toward safety over the course of a week. As Jake made his preparations for an extended stay in the impossible zone, he noticed something that made him reconsider everything he thought he understood about the situation. Hidden beneath years of accumulated dirt and debris, he could see the edge of something that was definitely not natural rock formation. The cubs were not just randomly trapped in a strange energy field. They were sitting on top of something that had been deliberately built and carefully concealed. Jake began brushing away the accumulated soil, revealing the smooth surface of what appeared to be artificial construction buried deep beneath the cave entrance. Whatever had created the zone that terrified every living creature on Zarian 7, it was not a natural phenomenon. Someone or something had built this place for a specific purpose, and the Shadow Panther cubs had stumbled into the middle of an ancient mystery that was far more complex than anyone had realized. Jake spent the first night in the zone learning how to sleep while his mind fought against the wrongness that pressed in from all directions. The Shadow Panther cubs stayed close to him, their warm bodies providing comfort that helped him ignore the oppressive silence. He had faced many dangerous situations during his military career, but nothing had prepared him for the psychological challenge of existing in a place that reality itself seemed to reject. The next morning brought the real work of gradually moving the cubs toward safety. Jake established a routine that mimicked the natural behavior patterns Dr. Corrin had described from her research. He fed the cubs small portions from his emergency rations, played with them to build trust, and slowly began leading them away from their cave shelter. The cubs resisted movement at first, their instincts warning them that leaving their safe space would bring danger. Jake countered their fear with patience and consistency, spending hours each day coaxing them to take just a few more steps toward the zone boundary. The process was exhausting because he had to fight his own desire to escape while encouraging the cubs to overcome theirs. Dr. Corrin monitored their progress through thermal imaging and radio contact, documenting behavior that challenged everything she thought she knew about animal psychology. The cubs were not just surviving their exposure to the zone's effects, but actually seemed to be growing stronger under Jake's care. Their vital signs improved daily despite the stressful environment, On the third day, Jake made his most significant discovery yet. While clearing more debris from around the artificial structure he had found, he uncovered what appeared to be a control panel covered in symbols that predated any known galactic civilization. The surface was smooth and unmarked by time, suggesting technology that could maintain itself across millennia. The moment Jake's hand touched the control surface, the symbols began glowing with soft blue light. Information flowed directly into his mind without passing through his normal senses, overwhelming him with knowledge about the zone's true purpose. He staggered backward and sat down heavily, his head spinning from the unexpected mental contact. The cubs gathered around him with concerned mewing sounds, pressing their small bodies against his sides as if trying to comfort him. Jake realized that they had been receiving similar information transfers since arriving at the cave, which explained why they seemed so calm despite being trapped in an impossible situation. Through the radio, Jake tried to explain what he had learned to the research team waiting outside the zone. The energy field was not a natural phenomenon or an accident, but a carefully designed preservation system created by an extinct civilization. The ancient builders had constructed a network of emergency shelters across the galaxy, activated automatically when extinction events threatened developing worlds. Commander Valor's voice crackled through the static as he requested more details about Jake's discovery. The human described how the shelter system was designed to protect young animals during catastrophic periods, using energy fields that would repel adult creatures while allowing juveniles to survive in safety until conditions improved. The cubs were not abandoned by their parents, Jake explained during a moment of clear radio reception. The adult Shadow Panthers could not enter because their genetic memory contains warnings about this place. The system was designed to separate young animals from adults during emergencies. Dr. Corrin found the implications fascinating and terrifying. If Jake was correct, similar shelters might exist on dozens of worlds throughout the galaxy, mistaken for natural phenomena because most species would instinctively avoid them. The technology represented a level of planning and foresight that surpassed anything known to current galactic civilization. Each day, Jake managed to move the cubs a little closer to the zone boundary. The process required incredible patience, because any attempt to rush them resulted in panic responses that set back their progress by hours. He learned to read their body language and emotional states, adjusting his approach based on their individual personalities and fears. The smallest cub, which Jake had named Brave for her willingness to explore new areas, adapted most quickly to the gradual transition. She began following Jake without hesitation and showed curiosity about the world beyond their shelter. The largest cub, who seemed to be the group's natural protector, remained cautious but was slowly learning to trust Jake's judgment. As they moved closer to the zone edge, Jake noticed that his own sensitivity to the wrongness was decreasing. His human adaptability was allowing him to function normally despite the psychological pressure that had initially been overwhelming. The cubs showed similar adaptation, becoming more relaxed and playful as they grew accustomed to the gradual changes. On the fifth day, disaster nearly struck when the control system Jake had discovered began showing signs of instability. The blue glow from the symbols flickered erratically, and the oppressive silence was broken by a low humming sound that made all 5 cubs huddle together in fear. Jake realized that the ancient shelter was finally reaching the end of its operational lifespan. He immediately contacted the research team and explained the situation. The shelter system was failing after operating continuously for thousands of years, and they had very little time left before the protective field collapsed completely. If the cubs were still inside when that happened, the sudden return to normal space would kill them instantly. Jake abandoned his careful, gradual approach and began moving the cubs as quickly as possible toward the boundary. The young Shadow Panthers sensed his urgency and followed without their usual resistance, trusting him completely despite their fear of leaving their protected environment. The ancient technology fought against complete failure. Its automated systems straining to maintain the field until its protected charges could reach safety. Jake could feel the wrongness intensifying around them as the shelter's power fluctuated wildly. The artificial structure he had uncovered was becoming visible to the naked eye. As its camouflage systems failed through the radio, he could hear Commander Valor coordinating with the adult Shadow Panthers outside the zone. The parent cats had sensed the change in the field and were pacing frantically along the boundary, their calls growing more urgent with each passing hour. Jake pushed forward through terrain that was becoming increasingly unstable as the shelter's reality manipulation systems broke down. The cubs stayed close to him, their phase-shifting fur rippling with anxiety, but their trust in the human remaining absolute. Behind them, the ancient installation was shutting down section by section, its millennia-long mission finally coming to an end. With less than half a mile remaining to the zone boundary, Jake could see the gathered animals in the distance. The sight gave him renewed energy for the final push toward safety, carrying the smallest cub while the others followed closely behind. Jake carried the smallest cub in his arms while the other four followed closely behind him as they approached the invisible boundary that had kept them trapped for 7 days. The ancient shelter system was failing around them, reality twisting and warping as millennia-old technology finally reached the end of its operational life. The humming sound had grown louder, and Jake could feel vibrations through the ground beneath his feet, the moment Jake's boots touched normal ground outside. The zone, the assembled wildlife, erupted in celebration that could be heard for miles across the valley. Birds took flight in massive clouds, ground animals stamped their feet and called out, and the Shadow Panthers themselves rushed forward with roars of pure joy that shook the research station windows. The adult Shadow Panthers surrounded Jake, and the cubs immediately, their massive bodies forming a protective circle while they sniffed and nuzzled their young. The reunion was overwhelming to watch as parents confirmed that their babies were alive and healthy after weeks of separation. The cubs mewed and purred while their mothers licked them from head to toe, checking every inch for injuries. Dr. Corin ran forward with her medical scanners, eager to examine the cubs and document their condition after spending so long in the impossible zone. Her readings showed that the young Shadow Panthers were not only healthy but somehow stronger than they had been before entering the shelter. Their neural development had accelerated during their time in the zone, and their natural phase-shifting abilities were more advanced than normal for their age. Behind them, the energy field that had protected the valley for thousands of years finally collapsed in a cascade of brilliant light that was visible from orbit. The ancient installation revealed itself fully for the first time, rising from the ground like a silver flower blooming in fast motion. The structure was beautiful and alien, covered in symbols that glowed briefly before fading as the power systems shut down permanently. Commander Valor watched the collapse through his instruments while coordinating with emergency teams positioned around the valley. The failure of the shelter system sent shockwaves through the ground that registered on seismic equipment across the continent. When the display finally went dark, he realized they had witnessed the end of technology that had operated since before his species had discovered fire. Captain Morrison and his rescue team arrived to escort Jake back to the research station. But the human was reluctant to leave the cubs so soon after their reunion. He remained with the Shadow Panther family for several hours, observing their behavior and ensuring that the young animals were adapting well to normal space. His presence seemed to comfort the cubs, who had bonded with him during their week. Together, the adult Shadow Panthers showed no aggression toward Jake, despite their natural wariness of other species. The parent cats seemed to understand that the human had risked his life to save their young, and they allowed him to remain close to the cubs without displaying any territorial behavior. Dr. Corin documented this unprecedented interspecies cooperation. With fascination, Jake's debriefing with the research team revealed the full scope of what they had discovered on Zarian 7. The ancient civilization that built the shelter network had included humans in their calculations, designing the system to allow human intervention when other species could not act. The fields were specifically calibrated to permit human passage while blocking access for other forms of life. Dr. Corin spent days analyzing the data collected during Jake's time in the zone, trying to understand how the shelter technology had worked. Her findings suggested that the ancient builders had studied human psychology and determined that humans possessed the unique combination of curiosity and stubbornness necessary to ignore evolutionary warnings and enter forbidden areas. The discovery had implications that reached far beyond the rescue of 5 shadow panther cubs. If similar shelters existed throughout the galaxy, they might contain other species that had been waiting centuries or millennia for rescue. Jake's success proved that humans could serve as a rescue force for situations that conventional technology could not handle. Commander Valor officially requested that Jake be assigned permanently to the Galactic Wildlife Conservation Corps as their first human specialist. The position would give him authority to ignore established safety protocols when dealing with impossible situations. Exactly the kind of job description that appealed to Jake's nature and experience. The Shadow Panther cubs grew rapidly under the care of their reunited family, their genetic diversity helping to strengthen the species' chances of long-term survival. More importantly, their rescue opened new possibilities for conservation efforts across the galaxy. Other impossible situations were already being reported from distant worlds, all requiring the kind of intervention that only humans seemed capable of providing. Jake accepted the assignment, but requested permission to return to his cabin in Alaska. Between missions, he needed the solitude and simplicity of his wilderness home to balance the complexity of galactic rescue operations. The Department of Impossible Situations agreed to his terms, understanding that his effectiveness depended on maintaining his connection to basic human survival skills. The ancient installation became a protected archaeological site studied by researchers from dozens of species. Their investigations revealed that the shelter network had operated automatically for over 10,000 years, activating whenever sensors detected extinction-level events on protected worlds. The builders had vanished long ago, but their legacy continued to save lives across the galaxy. Within weeks of the Zarian 7 incident, Jake began receiving requests for assistance from other worlds facing similar impossible situations. Wildlife trapped in quantum storms, colonies cut off by temporal anomalies, research stations surrounded by creatures that existed only in theoretical mathematics. Each case required the same combination of primitive equipment and stubborn determination that had saved the Shadow Panther cubs. Jake returned to his cabin to prepare for the next impossible mission, his communication array active and ready to receive calls from across the galaxy. He chopped wood, maintained his simple tools, and practiced the patience that would be required for rescues that made no logical sense to anyone except humans, who refused to accept that problems could be truly unsolvable. The cubs had survived. The species had been saved, and somewhere in the cosmic background radiation, other ancient systems waited patiently for the next impossible rescue that would require a human touch. Jake Mitchell had become the galaxy's specialist for problems that should not exist, armed with basic equipment and the most advanced problem-solving system in known space, human intuition backed by absolute refusal to accept defeat. The Shadow Panthers called to him across the valley as he worked, their voices carrying gratitude that transcended species barriers and reminded him why impossible rescues were always worth attempting.